Note to self, do not move the chair while talking. That makes a terrible noise. Hi, I'm MJ, and in today's video we're making something that is somewhat historically inspired. That is to say, it's inspired by a dress from the Queen's Gambit, though it's not a recreation of that dress. I have to admit, I have not watched the Queen's Gambit, and honestly I'm not planning to. I watched the trailer, but the plot just didn't grab me. However, the outfits did. And as all of my fellow costumers and history bounders were starting to lose their minds a little bit over some of those outfits and trying to recreate them and looking fabulous while doing so, inspiration started to hit me as well. See, I was gifted this bed sheet a while ago, which I had already made a skirt out of half of it, but I wasn't sure what to do with the other half. I was thinking a dress, but what kind of dress? But when people started sharing pictures of this dress from the Queen's Gambit, I knew that I wanted to dress like that. Not the plaid, not the wool, but the style of it, the shape. I do love me some sleeveless dresses, and I also really like the deep V in the front of the bodice. So I think this is what people call a pinafore dress. For the most part, pinafores I've seen are usually more apron than dress, and this one was more dress than apron, but with that deep V in the front, it's not really a dress you can wear on its own. Okay, yeah, no. That V is way too deep. Anyway, moving on, I had my fabric, though it was the wrong color, and I had the style dress that I wanted to make, though I would need to make the pattern myself. So let's get started. This is the fabric I will be using. It's a cotton flannel duvet cover that was gifted to me. Here you can see some leftover fabric from the skirt I've already made, and the original fabric. These are the pillowcases. And lastly, the part that I will be dyeing. I've already dyed it once, trying for a moss green, but it came out way too light, so it's getting another dye bath. I picked this Dylan Ocean Blue to dye the fabric with, a little unsure of how it would come out, and while the dye did its thing, I started on drafting the bodice. I took a bodice pattern that I made last year, I mean 2019, but I don't think I'm the only one who keeps saying last year to mean 2019, because I think we're all just trying to forget 2020 ever happened. Anyway, this bodice was altered from a Knip Mode magazine bodice until it fit me better, and I've been using it to make a couple of dresses. The darts are outlined with some holes I punched into the plastic sheet I used for the pattern, so the pattern is less floppy and shifty, but also I can mark the darts onto the fabric without lifting the pattern. You will be able to see me do this in a minute. The back piece should be fine as it is, so let's put that aside for now. To get that deep V, I'm just gonna eyeball the amount of overlap I want in relation to the center front and draw a diagonal line from the shoulder to that point. I pinned my pattern down so it wouldn't shift around and worked out the new shape. I'm using this fabric as a mock-up as well, so I'm doing this on a folded piece of fabric so that it will give me two pieces once I'm done. These are left over from a dress that I made years ago, and it's in odd bits and pieces, so evidently the first one I grabbed was not big enough, but the second one worked better.
I didn't feel like going too hard with this mock-up, so I just pasted the darts and seams by hand. Doing a ladder stitch for the darts is something I picked up from another costuber. I just can't for the life of me remember who it was. It's a quick way to do a mock-up and also to baste the fabric into the right shape before sewing it on a machine on the final garment. After doing the side and shoulder seams, I overlapped the front edges and basted those down. Then I also basted in a zipper with some help from Casper. I tried on the mock-up and noticed that the front edge was gaping a bit. I figured this was probably due to those edges being on the bias, and while at this point I was still planning to face the edges and knew that sewing those facings would strengthen it, I figured I'd try a second mock-up with those edges on the straight of grain, and that worked out pretty well. So here's how the dye job ended up. Still a bit more muted than I was hoping for, but I did like it. Problem was, I liked both the right side and the wrong side of the fabric, and I just could not decide which side I wanted to make this dress out of. So I put it to Instagram and the vote came out just barely in favor of the wrong side, with its slightly brighter blue. However, while I had been hoping the poll would help me pick one over the other, instead I was still in two minds, especially with how close the poll ended up. So I moped about this for a few days until the answer came to me in the shower. I should just make it reversible. That way I could have both and I didn't actually have to pick between the two. With that decided, I could work on working out how to cut the fabric. To make it reversible, I figured that the easiest way would be to have it actually be a wrap dress. The Queen's Gambit dress seemed to be a faux wrap with a zipper in the back, so between this and a different fabric, I think you guys can see why this is not a recreation at all. I knew I wanted to have a circle skirt and play with the direction of the stripes on the bodice, while keeping the diagonal neckline on the straight of grain. I did the circle skirt first, folding my fabric in half and calculating the necessary radius for my waist measurement plus the overlap of the wrap, and then working out the length to about knee length from there. Once I had the skirt cut out, I put my pattern pieces on it to try out different placements. I started out with finding a placement for the wrong side of the fabric. This took some hemming and hawing and unfolding my fabric to pin the left and right sides of the dress separately so I could make sure the fabric pattern matched. I also thought it would be fun to have the wrong and right side use the stripes differently, so that it wouldn't simply be the reverse. I also like the sections with the pinstripes better on the wrong side of the fabric than the right side, so for the right side I went with the lighter sections of the pattern. Is it getting confusing with the right and wrong sides? Especially since this dress won't technically have a right or wrong side. I think I'll go with light and dark sides from now on instead. The light side being bluer and showing less of the striped pattern, and the dark side showing the pattern but being darker and less blue. Here I'm pinning the light side pattern pieces right sides together to match the stripes and make sure both sides are mirrored. Then I did the same for the dark side pieces. With everything cut out, I went to work on constructing the dress, starting with putting in the darts and then sewing each layer of the bodice together separately, except for the side seams. Keeping straight on each layer, which was the right side and wrong side, was kind of tricky, but the different ways I used the stripes on the fabric did help there. Once I had the front and back connected at the shoulders for each layer, first I ironed all the seams flat and pressed out the darts. Then I put them right sides together and sewed all along the arm size and along the front, across the neck, back down the front. I pressed and clipped those seams and then turned the bodice inside out through the shoulders. Then I pressed again with lots of steam for nice clean edges. Did I forget to film this? Sorry about that. Once the edges looked nice and sharp, I flipped it partially inside out again so that I could put the side seams of each layer together right sides in. Since the armholes were already sewn, this meant that each side seam was basically one long seam, going from the waist of the light side to the arm side to the waist of the dark side. I sewed this carefully to avoid seam allowances getting caught in awkward ways and creating bulk I didn't want. After pressing these seams open, I went back into the arm size to press those nice and crisp again, and with that the bodice was more or less done. Moving on to the skirt. It being a wrap dress, I knew I had to cut open the circle on one side and picked a place where the stripes in the fabric went horizontally. Before sewing it onto the bodice, I wanted to hem that edge first, since I wouldn't be lining it and I could hardly leave it raw. I quickly realized that I could cut a facing to match the pattern on the dark side of the fabric, so that this hem would be the least noticeable possible on both sides. Sewing on the facing, I started doing it wrong. You can see me realize this here. The right way to do this is to start with it on the light side of the skirt with the light side of the facing up as well. I sewed this using a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. I've been using this seam allowance all throughout so far. Did I mention that? Anyway, then I trimmed the seam allowance, pressed it over to the dark side and folded under the raw edge another 1 centimeter. Pinned it down, making sure the edge matched the pattern on the skirt, and top stitched this. I apparently completely forgot to film this, but you'll see me do the same for the hem later. The next step was to attach the skirt and bodice together. First I pinned, then sewed the light side of the skirt to the light side of the bodice. I clipped this seam allowance as well and pressed it to the inside of the bodice, then turned over 1 centimeter on the dark side of the fabric, pinned it and top stitched it to the now combined skirt and bodice. The top stitching didn't turn out entirely straight on the light side, and I probably should have done this the other way around, but it's hardly noticeable and I did not feel like unpicking and redoing this. At this point the dress was almost done, and am I the only one who basically disregards hemming as a step in finishing a dress? I always feel like a dress is done at this stage. Anyway, before hemming, I needed to let the skirt hang for a bit, so in the meantime I realized the crossover point also needed closure still. I decided on snaps, but then also felt like a decorative button would look good. I grabbed a few from my stash and ended up doing another Instagram poll between 3 of the buttons. Again, this turned out quite close. For a long time, all 3 buttons having the exact same amount of votes, but in the end, the middle button won out. In the meantime, I also created some continuous bias tape from my remaining fabric. Continuous bias tape is pretty magical. I need to Google how to do it every time, but this skirt was almost 5 meters at the hem and I needed just a 39 by 39 centimeter square to get enough bias tape to cover it and have a comfortable margin. I sewed this on pretty much the same way as the straight edge I cut into the skirt earlier, with the bias tape on the light side of the fabric, then turning it to the dark side and turning under the raw edge and top stitching it. It being a 5 meter hem, this took a while, but I like sewing with some costumers or let's plays in the background, and before I know it, I'm done. And here is the final result. I am so chuffed with how this came out. It is supremely comfortable. I love the deep V over a long sleeve t-shirt, and the circle skirt is twirl heaven. I was a little bit worried that the amount of overlap in the wrap might not be enough, but going through all this footage I did not see anything indecent even once, so I think I'll be fine. I expect to wear this with some sort of petticoat a lot anyway, partly for a bit of body, but also to prevent this fabric sticking to my leggings and or itself. which I already knew it was prone to do from the skirt I made earlier. I'm wearing an organza petticoat I made myself in these clips.
All in all, I am still not sure which side of the dress I actually prefer, whether the light side or the dark side, which I guess is a good sign that making it reversible was the right choice. I suppose I'll pick which side to show based on the mood I'm in, or depending on where we're going, which granted is nowhere this day and age, but we're gonna be able to go places sometime in the future, right? I also love how the stripe pattern on the fabric looks depending on which side is showing. The way that it's a lot more colorful but subtle on the lighter side and then much more pronounced on the darker side. I also particularly love the way that the stripes intersect at the edges of the overlapped skirt. I just think that looks really neat. It wasn't something that I specifically designed into this dress, but rather a consequence of making a circle skirt and then wrapping the edges. It's just the way that the grain of the fabric works, but it looks fun and I'm keeping it. So the end result might not look at all like the dress from the Queen's Gambit, but that's what sparked my inspiration. And I'm really happy that people went nuts over this dress, because up until that point I had no idea what I wanted to make with this fabric. Alright, I think that about does it for this video. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye!